We're pleased to have all of you with us here tonight for the final night of our Hayward lectures. And we're so grateful to Dr. Randy Woodley, who I trust you've gotten to know a bit this week, and his wife Edith, who have been here doing an outstanding job of our lectures this week. Together, the Woodleys have served among some of the most disenfranchised communities in North America for more than 3 decades of faithful service, and we're grateful to have them here. Randy tells me also that if he could do anything, he perhaps would run his farm full-time. That's Eloheh Farm and Seeds. You can look them up at elohehseeds.com. It's a nonprofit teaching farm. They cultivate ancient seeds and do all sorts of wonderful work caring for our creation there. Well, Randy's lectures and stories this week have been challenging and stimulating, and so we look forward to his thoughtful leadership again tonight. If you have enjoyed hearing from him this week, you'll want to check out his books, as we've discussed earlier, outside, but you also might want to listen to his podcast, Piecing It Together. That's P-E-A-C-I-N-G, It Together. You can find that on iTunes or piecingittogether.com. And you can also find more information about the Woodleys' lives and ministries at randywoodley.com. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Woodley back tonight for the final night of the 2019 Hayward Lectures.
So at one point in my life, I was what we called a commissioned missionary. And I spent 2 years in Kodiak, Alaska, the Kodiak Baptist Mission. I call those my missionary oppressor years. Working with Inuit and Aleut and Athabascan and troubled teens. And we were, it was a pretty hard conflict in terms of trying to set them on the right path with the particular behavioral model they had, and also violate their cultural standards. And about drove me crazy. And after 2 years, I decided, and in fact, someone had said, my pastor had said, well, why don't you go to seminary? And I said, no, I know I've heard that word. What is a seminary again? And so I did. And while I was there, I was hoping to actually write a book about a fellow who I read all 12 boxes of his journals. In fact, he's probably, from everything I hear, he's probably a lot like Silas Rand with the Mi'kmaq people. But his name was Evan Jones. He was with our Cherokee people. And he was a Welshman, of course. And he did a wonderful job. And basically, my question when I went to seminary was, how do I do ministry among my own people without oppressing them? That was really what I went to seminary with. And through reading all 12 boxes of his original journals, I discovered some principles for my ministry from that point on. And then I was a commissioned missionary and went to Oklahoma. I was hoping to write a book about Jones. And when I went to do my PhD, I was hoping to do my PhD work on Jones. But at the time, I felt like there was maybe more service that I could be to our Native community in doing something else. And so that something else is the first thing I want to talk to you about tonight. So maybe a better way to do that would have just been to say, I'm about to bore you with my doctoral dissertation. And since no one can ever remember the names of their dissertations, you see mine there. I'm just going to quickly tell you what I did because it connects with what we're going to talk about tonight. So I asked a couple questions. I said, do Native Americans generally have a generally shared set of values that could guide the construction of new models for mission and theology of North American Native communities? And if so, to what degree are these values shared among Native American communities? And what resources, particularly values, are available within the Native American communities themselves for developing appropriate models of mission and theology? And could such resources be developed into authentic integral models? So those were my questions that I began with. I had a biblical theological construction of Shalom, basically based on Walter Brueggemann's work, a contextually based anthropologically informed missiology, an indigenous construction of decolonization and indigenization for mission and theology. Utilized literature from other fields, such as you can see there, anthropology, education, psychology, history, sociology, and religion. And I interviewed 8 elders who spoke the language, who were spiritual leaders in their communities with extensive interviews. Surveyed 100 Native Americans from almost every region of the U.S. and Canada, and I'll show you those. Responses were analyzed using grounded theory as a way to discover and organize a system of values. And these are the regions. Each dot doesn't represent one tribe, it represents various tribes in that region. And some of the tribes are listed there on the side that you can see. And in that, I linked the elder surveys, or the elder interviews and the survey responses with literature regarding Native American values studies, discourse, and experiences. As the values categories emerged, I was able to establish among Native Americans a widely held construct referred to generally as the harmony way. Now, I had some suspicion that this was present. I knew it was in my own tribe. I knew it was among the Navajo, but I wanted to see how widespread it was among our indigenous people of the Americas. I was then able to deduce, isolate, and examine 10 core values that exist within the framework of the Native American Harmony Way, commonly held among all 45 tribal groups represented. And by the way, each elder that I interviewed, every single interview went just like this. I would say, among my people, we have a construct called Elohe. And in that, it means everything is in harmony, everything is in balance. The ground is producing what it should. Nobody's at war. People are generally happy. And then by about that time, they would say, oh, yeah, we have that also, and it's called so-and-so. And then I'd just allow them to talk about that. Merged all that together, and I came up with 10 Harmony Way values, and I want to go over those. Because you can't say that they're universal among indigenous people, because I only did 45 tribes. I learned that in academia. You can only say what you did, right? So at least among 45 tribes, it's a widespread construct. 1, tangible spirituality. Belief in the great mystery, creator, creation, including land and water, is natural and spiritual. Ceremonies and traditions are practiced. Societies are vital, heavily symbolic. Authority often comes from reflected experience. A lot of these you'll see that have been reflected in the talk so far. 2, life is governed by harmony. Seek to maintain balance in all of life. Life in harmony is expressed as a circle or hoop. Seek peace. Humans are mostly good with some evil. Fear is a catalyst for virtue. 3, community is essential. Women are sacred. Children are loved, elders are respected, family is vital, everyone is integrally related. 4, humor is sacred and necessary. Humor is a part of the balance, both impromptu and designed in ceremony. 5, cooperative communality. Consensus gives dignity. High tolerance, dissension is respected. Process includes hearts and minds. Diversity gives strength and balance to life. 6, orality. Words have primordial power. Traditions are passed orally. Stories are a main vehicle for teaching and sustaining quiet, respectful communication. 7, present and past time orientation. Present engagement overrides future scheduling. We call that Indian time. Fluidity between past and present. Futures are determined by looking to the past. Number 8, open work ethic. Meaningful work. Work is needed. Identity is in both doing and being. Lifestyle with few constraints. 9, hospitality and generosity, both personally and ceremonially done without regret or hesitation. And 10, natural connectedness to all creation. Creation is seen as an integrated whole in which we are all related. Model for harmony, reciprocity, keepers or stewards, ceremony, teaching. And I hope that if you have any questions about any of those when we're finished here, that you will ask those and we can elaborate those further. But I did sort of dumb them down, if you will, because my daughter is using those in a camp, and she wanted it so at a level that, third to sixth graders could look at as she was teaching. So if you want this version, abridged or the summation is respect. Respect the earth and every living creature. Everyone and everything is sacred, highly symbolized. Harmony. Seek harmony and cooperation with people and nature. Friendship. Increase the number and depth of your close friends and family. Laughter. Laugh at yourself. We're merely human. Equality. Everyone expresses their voice and decisions. Authenticity. Speak from your heart. History. Learn from past. Move forward by looking back. Work, rest, balance. Work hard but rest well. Generosity, share what you have with others. Accountability, we're all interconnected and interrelated. So I was able to show that 45 tribes practice those. And at my particular school, we had about 60% folks from other countries as well. And I had already spent a lot of time with different Indigenous people around the world. And so I come to find out as I was doing this, and we would talk to one another, the students would talk to one another, that the Maori also in New Zealand had a construct similar to this, the Aboriginals in Australia, Zulu, South Africa, Maasai, and Samburu in Kenya, Ikalahan in northern island of the Philippines, Hawaiians, the aloha, right? It's so much more than aloha. And on and on. So I was able to sit down with Walter Brueggemann one time, and I asked him, I said, I had this experience when I was doing this, and I said, would I be overstating it if I said these sound like humanity's original instructions? And he said, absolutely not. He said, I've found the same thing all over the world. So we all are indigenous from somewhere, and I'm a big encourager for people to find their own indigeneity in whatever form they would like to do that. So our indigenous harmony way constructs are much like ancient Jewish concepts of shalom. Some of the words, as you know, shalom, shalem, shalom, etc., translate to peace, restoration of creation, prosperity, respect, justice, truth, acceptance, restitution, abundance, equity, integrity, intimacy, growth, well-being, restored relationship, and a place where God is in charge. Quoting Brueggemann, shalom is the end of coercion. Shalom is the end of fragmentation. Shalom is the freedom to rejoice. Shalom is the courage to live an integrated life in a community of coherence. These are not simply neat values to be added on. They are massive protests against the central values by which our world operates. The world depends on coercion. The world depends on fragmented loyalties. The world as presently ordered depends on these very conditions against which the gospel protects and to which it provides alternatives. And a picture in the New Testament of what shalom looks like. I can quote this in King James without looking at it. Above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. And don't neglect, and right after he talks about love, hospitality, which I say is always the first step of shalom. Don't neglect to be hospitable to one another. And when you take someone in your home, don't complain. As each one has received a gift from the givers, use it to serve one another. And I think the New Testament writers and Jesus himself, these were embedded in their thinking. So, what does the shalom look like? God's intended shalom throughout the festivals, the Genesis passage, the Sabbath years and lands. As you know, the 1/7 for the agrarian society, 1/7 is set aside to remain fallow each year, and then eventually, on the 7th year, everything is set aside. And why is that? It's for the poor. It's for the animals, for the wild animals, for the ox, and for animals. And then, of course, part of that whole system is the same where you forget a bunch of grapes out in the field, leave them because other people will get them. You forget a bunch of wheat out in the field, you leave them because the poor will need them. You don't glean the edges of your field because those who need it can come and gather. So this whole, what I call Shalom Sabbath Jubilee continuum, is always about making sure that the most marginalized in society get taken care of. And you judge it by how you treat the foreigners, the immigrants. You judge it by how the widows and the orphans are treated. And I believe, as I've looked at the scriptures with my harmony way lenses and not interjecting too much eisegesis, that this is exactly what Jesus was teaching, was a shalom kingdom. And that New Testament ethics are shalom ethics. Shalom is always tested on the margins, on the powerless, the poor, the oppressed, the disenfranchised, and the marginalized. The Old Testament narrative, Genesis 1 through 11, is a story of shalom established and broken. Genesis 3 to 11, all the relationships are taken care of. 3, 4, and 5, man to woman. 3, 8 to 13, 21 to 23, humanity to God, where are you? Humanity to animals, skins to cover themselves. Humanity to the earth, thorns, work, weeds expelled from the garden. Members of the same family in 4:9, am I my brother's keeper? And ethnic groups, 11 to chapter 11, verse 4 and following, the whole story of Babel, which I'd be glad to commence to preach a sermon on because that's one of my favorite things, but I'll save myself from that right now. Jesus' kingdom is a story of shalom. It's a shalom kingdom, both old and new, and restored. To America's indigenous peoples, ours is a story of shalom being established and broken by the Europeans. The doctrine of discovery, terra nullius, Puritan theology, manifest destiny, residential boarding schools, reservations, assimilation, present and current lawsuits, past lawsuits like Cobell versus Salazar in our country. All of those show a intentional effort to break shalom among our people. To indigenous peoples, the problem of a Western worldview are obvious. The way of life demonstrated by Western peoples leads to alienation from the earth, from others, and from all of creation. It creates a false bubble called Western civilization, which the West feels will protect them from calamity. This false hope is built on age-old philosophical ideas handed down from Greece, Rome, England, and other Western nation states. What can turn the people who call themselves by Christ's name into people who actually kill, steal, and destroy people, land, and nature with genocidal passion? Comparing the characteristics of a Western worldview, particularly in the United States, with the characteristics of an American Indigenous worldview. I'll just go down the list quickly for the Western side. Physically dualistic, morally dualistic, essentially spiritual, religiously intolerant, individualistic, extrinsically categorical, hierarchical, humor reserved for non-spiritual, competitive greed-based, utopian, white supremacist, words are not binding, work in order to work, anthropocentric, triumphalist, and patriarchal. The characteristics of an American Indigenous worldview: physically and morally holistic, tangible spirituality, life governed by harmony and tolerance, community is essential, egalitarian, humor is sacred and necessary, peace-seeking, cooperative consensus gives dignity, diversity gives strength, words have primordial power, purposeful and meaningful work, natural interconnectedness to all creation, and hospitality, generosity. Again, there are wonderful aspects to a Western worldview. Those are not the ones I'm talking about today. And there are some terrible aspects to an Indigenous worldview. But I believe I'm comparing apples to apples here. The foundational fallacy is dualism in the Western worldview. To invest in the ethereal, spiritual, metaphysical, abstract realm to a higher degree than the physical. Our thoughts and our theologies become disembodied, secular and sacred. Believe God is at work in the church more than in the world, for example. The physical, such as land, goods, works, our bodies, all become suspect. Creates binary thinking. Things are either right or wrong, either legal or illegal, either heaven or hell, sin or holiness, success or failure, civilized or primitive, introvert or extrovert, saved or lost, clean or dirty, weeds or plants, animals or varmints, etc. It makes it difficult for Western thinkers to hold two seemingly incompatible things in tension without having to find a resolution, and creates a false assumption that all things may be understood and every problem may be solved. It also creates extrinsic compartmentalization. Reductionism divides and erroneously classifies life into many parts with little attention given to the whole. Creates extrinsic, often unrelated categories that are partial realities. Partial realities can often become false realities, forgetting the whole. Things like climate change, medical field, systematic theology, etc. Salvation is for our souls and not the whole earth. Out of dualism is almost inevitable to have a hierarchy. Everything is ranked greater or lesser. Equality is wrong, or at least not a preferred system, even if you call it democratic. The results of historical Western structured systems have created dehumanization by class, race, ethnicity, gender, religion, nationality, etc. Anthropocentrism, humans are above nature. Absence of hierarchy, equality, and equity does not mean anarchy or absence of leadership. I'm making that point. And I mentioned here for church historians Ignatius of Antioch's hierarchical contextualization move to try and make it a little easier on the church, but unfortunately, and I'm sure Ignatius had no idea what would happen, but when that hierarchy met Constantinian Empire, it created Christendom. Utopianisms, a shared myth of most movements, living for another world in the future or in the past, negates our humanity, human frailty, and seeks perfection. It ends the other world. The ends of the other world justify the means in this world. Individualism, loss of corporate and community. Interpret the scriptures for me, but they were not written from or for an individualistic worldview. Competitiveness over cooperation. Majority rule over consensus. I don't know how you all do it in Canada. I have some idea, but in the United States, we have this thing, 51% wins the day. And so you leave with 49% mad. Who ever thought of that system? White supremacy. White, light-skinned, Western European descent people have the inherent right to control all governance, knowledge, wealth, and power in any given system. A symptom of otherism. Greeks had barbarians, Romans had savages, English had the heathen, North Americans have Native Americans, African Americans, LGBTQ, immigrants, Muslims. We have them all in the United States. Creates intolerance for difference. Laws and other systems are formed to maintain control. Modern expressions of our white normalcy and white privilege. Materialism, simply things over people, greed. J. Paul Getty, he said, asked him one day, what does it take to be happy? How much money does it take to be happy? And he said, just a little more. Propositional thinking, another symptom of the Western worldview, and related to dualism. Linear A to B thinking. It seems more efficient. Story is added for entertainment. I talk about sometimes the 4 books, creation, community, our hearts, and the scriptures being the 4 books that we should study. The scriptures are in large part oral story or narrative, perhaps up to 90%. Ken Bailey says, if theology is expressed in concepts and structured by philosophy and logic, then the primary tools required are a good mind and the ability to think logically. But if theology is presented in story form, the meaning of the story cannot be fairly ascertained without becoming, as much as possible, a part of the culture of the storyteller and his or her listeners. How do Enlightenment-bound thinkers understand story? How do you think Western individualism, binary logic, and present-future orientation to reality affects theology? What could communal thinking and worldviews that are more comfortable with tension and mystery and oriented towards a past-present reality offer theological discussion and the scholarly community? A common way of viewing life in our Native American cultures is through a circle, sacred circle or sacred hoop. The circle has no end or no beginning. It is all-encompassing, and any point on the circle can be reached by anyone. The circle is used here to illustrate shalom, salvation, and healing in Christ. And I took those down because I knew it would take too much time to go through, sorry. One quote about the circle I like, the image of living on earth in harmony with creation and therefore the Creator is a helpful image for me. Each day we are given is for thanksgiving for the earth. We are to enjoy it and share it in a service of others. This is the way to grow in unity and harmony. There's a word that is central to the movement and to harmony with other communities, and that is respect. In Christian teaching, the word used is love. It allows for diversity within the unity of the Creator. There are many teachings in the Aboriginal North American nations that use the symbol of the circle. It is the symbol for the inclusive, caring community, where individuals are respected and interdependence is recognized. In wider perspective, it symbolizes the natural order of creation, and human beings are a part of that whole circle of life. Aboriginal spiritual teachers speak of the reestablishment of the balance between human beings and the whole of creation as mending the hoop. So what is the path? To agree on a common truth of the history of white supremacy, to deconstruct our own Western worldviews, to recognize the strength Indigenous people have to survive and the wisdom they have to contribute, to reconcile with the land by protecting it and restoring it, to find a white identity as an ally working against white supremacy, to make reparations to Indigenous peoples, and to go through a similar process with anyone else with whom it is needed. Spirituality demonstrated by vulnerability. The Creator, as I mentioned, I believe is the most vulnerable being who exists. Could it be that God is the most vulnerable being who exists? If God is love, and love means being vulnerable, then God must represent the essence of vulnerability. The incarnation of Jesus expressed great mysteries of vulnerability. Jesus' lifestyle of hanging out with the poor, the marginalized, empowering women, healing lepers, etc., expressed Creator's vulnerability. The crucifixion demonstrated God's vulnerability. Jesus, coming from a Shalom Trinity, sharing Creator's mission of love with us, and leaving the responsibility in our hands to co-act with God by structuring love as Shalom, is a radical expression of the most vulnerable Creator God. In Jesus, we are invited to become fellow human beings with others who are different from us, to exchange and empower dignity in ourselves and others, to join in reciprocal conversation of each other's understanding of truth, and to live with, for, and among the community of creation, including people, in Shalom. The opposite of vulnerability is control, including the illegitimate use of power. The illegitimate use of power via white supremacy and religious cultural hegemony is among the primary failures of Western colonizer Christianity. Structural change is needed now. And because at this point people always say, well, what do we need to do? I just wanted to give a few examples of a little bit of thinking. The problems associated with change are many. There usually exists a wide gap between the people who set policy, resulting in structure, and the people who are affected by policy. Those affected most and those who are expected to abide by the policy must have input turned into ownership in the whole process. This gap exists for numerous reasons, including misunderstanding the role of power, simple homeostasis, lack of common experience and misunderstanding, pragmatism, short-term thinking, ego, etc. Systems tend to become corrupted over time with these gap maladies. If structures don't remain pliable, they can become rigid and callous to those in the system, and they most often need breaking. Still, the system's DNA is of primary importance. Think DNA as an organizational atmosphere, vision and process, not the actual rules or structure. The atmosphere that includes the following values can be helpful to foster long-term change. Relationship building, the most primary. Trust building, humor, equal empowerment, diversity of opinions and individual giftings appreciated in tangible ways, risky questions, even sometimes unruliness. Appreciate out-of-the-box innovations even when they are not a great success. Acceptance of both tradition and non-tradition, verifiable communication tools and devices, vulnerability and acceptance of our common humanity. Some final thoughts. Words have little to no value to Christian leaders who are maintaining a corrupt system. The downward spiral from the system managers to the truth tellers' demise goes like this. Ignore and or deny it. Have a feigned acceptance or good intentions. Good words and good intentions or pacification. Then blaming the messenger and gathering support for blame. And then rejecting the messenger completely through ostracizing or removing them. So you must count the cost if you want change. Is making change worth it to you? Are the lives of Indigenous peoples worth it to you? Thank you.
We've had another thought-provoking presentation this evening from Dr. Woodley, and I know you will want to comment, ask him questions. This is his last evening with us, so please take full advantage of this opportunity. The microphone is available here, as well as online comments. So who'd like to ask first?
wanted to ask this one last night, but there were so many people. I didn't want to barge in front of the line. As you've been speaking these nights, I've been wondering a lot about what is the relationship between story and fact. And I'm not here thinking about pitting these two worldviews against each other, but I think there were a couple of times, for example, last night where you mentioned fact as a positive thing. And then there's this power of story. And so if I could clarify this in a couple of ways, I guess what I'm asking in a way is, what is the relevance then, say, of the Jesus of history? The fact of the historical resurrection, for example, as it plays out in story. Is there a relationship between those two things? Is that the wrong question? And then in a very practical and contemporary sense, I think about the TRC process in Canada, where storytelling was so essential. If you really want to engage the TRC process, you have to spend the hours reading the stories. But the stories established a truth, something that happened in history, because if it didn't do that, then how can we be responsible to act? It's, that's a story. And maybe we can, write a different story or tell a different story, but somehow it seems crucial that there was a fact established of something that happened in history that we need to acknowledge and do something about, even if we're not exactly sure what that is always. So is my question making sense?
Probably yammer around a bit to get to the answer, but
yeah, okay. But it's this story and fact. Does it matter if story is preeminent? Does it matter the facts of history, or am I coming at this from an unhelpful perspective? But this is what I'm wrestling with: this relationship between story and fact.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. As you know, we have different kinds of stories. We don't really classify them like, okay, now I'm going to tell a story that's not true. Now I'm going to, and so one of the mysteries is, you never quite know, right? I mean, you can be pretty sure when we start talking about the animals coming together and they did this trick and that, and but there are also stories of our ancient beginnings and our relationship with the Creator and our covenants that were made that are pretty, that I think people would, if you press them, they say, well, that's fact. It's just that no one ever asks that. No one ever says, it doesn't come, it's nothing that comes up and you go, is that really true or not? Because you get what's needed out of it, right? So the truth is in there, whether it's fact or not fact. And so I don't know how to answer that in terms of things like the resurrection. It's been sort of the Western obsession to prove the Bible, right? Ever since the fundamentalist progressive split, to sort of one side to say, no, all of this really happened. I think it could be an important question. I just don't think it's my question. And the reason it's not my personal question is because I have a relationship with Jesus, the Spirit. And he talks to me, and I talk to him. Now, I wish he talked to me more often. But through lots of different kinds of ways. And so I have a relationship in the Spirit, just as I talked about the story of the elder who was teaching all the medicine men, had a relationship and talked in the Spirit, because Jesus is not here in the flesh, at least not literally. And so in the Jesus that I have conversations with, it makes sense when I read the stories that, oh, yeah, that makes sense, because that's what I'm feeling in my heart when I'm talking to Jesus. And so I don't have to have, for someone to say to me, do you believe in the physical resurrection? I can say, sure. But it's just not my question. I don't know if that makes sense. And I don't know, maybe other people feel differently, other Indigenous people feel differently. I'm coming from what I've observed from a traditional perspective. Fact and truth somehow are not, I'd say truth overrides fact, maybe is the way to say it. Yeah.
I think I might have a follow-up, but I'll have to ponder it.
Okay, yeah, and I'll be thinking about this one for a while too, because I just don't spend time thinking about that.
Yeah.
You know?
I think if I had a follow-up, and you don't have to answer it, it can just maybe go in the grist, and as you sort it out, you can tell me, so I don't have to do it. But I'm interested in the impact then too on what we understand to be Christian mission, and mission, of course, has been seen as part of the colonial project. I get all of that, and how do we then understand our mission? I know you talk about establishing harmony in Christ and that sort of thing, but we still have that, it seems like an impetus to tell some things. We can tell stories, I guess, but what does mission look like in a world where those of us who are white don't want to extend the colonial project, but we do believe that it's good for all people to come to know Jesus.
Yeah, and since I'm a missiologist, I think I actually am prepared to answer that one.
Right.
So I have, and I don't have them with me, I don't have them by memory, but I have these, Dr. Woodley's 10 missiological imperatives. And they go something like this, that there's nowhere you can go where Jesus isn't already active in calling people to himself. Secondly, that our job is first to observe where Jesus is active, and whether it's your next door neighbor or someone across the waters, it doesn't matter. Where is Jesus active? If you believe the first, then you have to observe the second. Thirdly would be that, I don't remember the order now, I'm getting mixed up, but the first thing would be, once you find out where Jesus is active, then to convert to that in that culture, because our job as humble servants of Christ is to first convert to their truth, not to expect them to convert to ours. And to understand that God expects 2 conversions out of every process. And when I'm saying conversion, it's little c. Like I look at salvation. To me, a better word that captures salvation is healing. And healing is a process. We begin our healing, we complete our healing, but we're also being healed. So as Paul said, now are we much closer now to our own salvation or healing than when we first began. And then part of that is decolonizing our own thinking, and then as much as possible through the help of cultural guides, indigenizing ourselves to that culture, and then at the proper time, when given permission, then it's time to share our truth. And that's sort of how I understand mission and evangelism, so to speak. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I've not asked you my question, so I'll do it tonight. And this is not an accusation. This is hopefully a chance for you to talk about something that you've sort of talked a bit about. What's the difference between enculturating the gospel and syncretism?
Okay.
To put it in terms others might use, aren't you imposing indigenous theology on the scriptures, and you are somehow then polluting pure theology?
Mm-hmm.
You want to talk about that a bit?
Well, unless we can live first century Greek Hellenized lives, we're not going to be able to impose, to help from imposing our own cultures on the scriptures, right? But yeah, and that question comes oftentimes when we speak. One of the ways people ask it is, how far is too far? And my question, or my answer is always, that's not up for us to decide. That's up to the body to decide. The people who are dealing with it, and we dealt with this actually in the Red Couch Room. The book of Acts 15, in chapter 15, is this major thing that happens, right? And they came up with like 4 things to do to basically keep people away from idolatry. And then even some of those are relaxed later on. You know, Paul says, well, there's really no such thing as idols. Don't let people see you eating meat, strangled idols, you know. But, and so there's just a few things. And, you know, I like to think as, you know, our churches and our denominations, et cetera, would come up with a whole book of things, you know, for the Gentiles to do. And so I think this idea of trusting the Holy Spirit to work within the people and in the process with outside help, but outside people as junior partners, not as senior partners, is the way to develop a contextual theology in one's own culture. So I mentioned the other day that I knew a missionary to the Calahan Filipinos, and the whole village became followers of Christ in their own unique cultural ways, and I was able to spend time with him. One time, he's a very old gentleman who was there for like 50, 60 years. He was eventually adopted as an elder and tribal member. But I asked him, I said, what was the key for you? And he said, I simply told the stories and I allowed them to theologize. I trusted them. I trusted the Spirit to theologize, and worked out good. Maybe sometimes it doesn't, but I'm not sure we actually have the right to impose our cultures on those cultures who are trying to figure it out. Yeah.
I would fully concur with that, and just add, I find it's a very, I don't know what word it would be, self-righteous of us unknowingly to say that there's a pure theology and that's ours. Because ours is, as I've talked about before, and as my students often hear, ours is so Greek philosophically based. That's the language we use. What right do we have to tell others that they can't speak in the language of their culture and bring the gospel that way?
Yeah. So sometimes when I was less graceful, I would say, now are you talking about syncretism in Anglo culture? Is that what you want me to comment on?
This is a question that's come in online for you regarding your 10 values of the Harmony Way. How do you reconcile with that with some aspects of Jesus' teaching that, for instance, we'll be hated and persecuted for our faith at times, and we even should expect the same type of persecution that Jesus himself experienced? And as well as the perspective on the end, kind of eschatological end of war. How do we reconcile that with something, with the Harmony Way principles that you're talking about?
Well, I think that gives away that person's eschatology right there. And that's not the one I believe. So, but I don't really understand the conflict that they're presenting. I don't understand. I mean, you can have persecution and you can still seek to live out a harmonious Shalom lifestyle. So I don't understand the conflict. Maybe they could write more and let us know where the conflict is. Yeah.
Thank you again for a fascinating lecture. I wanted to ask you a question, wasn't so theological as such, more sort of practical. The culture we're talking about in the reference to the kind of Western civilization and thought has really in the last 20 or 30 years dramatically changed. And in particular, the advent of the globalization of culture, technology, the Googleization of everything really. Do you sense that the historical reference to this notion of a kind of a Western mindset is now increasingly redundant because there is no, in post-modernity, there is really no kind of sense of what is Western. The Western countries are now comprised of many people from many different original cultures. Many people, even in indigenous communities, are being so affected by the advent of virtual reality, which itself is removed from the notion of the land. And the arrival of huge international global corporations, which really, in many ways, in my view anyway, are the kind of the oppressors and the colonizers of the present. Do you therefore think that the language you're using in the presentation is perhaps open to be moved and changed away from the historical understanding of the Western civilization and thought to really a more globalized advance of corporations and the globalization of culture.
So in New York, they say, "From your lips to God's ears." So I would that it was so. I think it's easy for us to think that when we're in advanced thinking settings. But of course, I don't live in Canada, so I don't know. Maybe Canada's completely changed. But in the United States, what I'm talking about is still very common. I think that it is so ubiquitous that there are these hidden snakes that we have to find that are still there that we might overlook, that will come back and bite us if we don't continue to dig in the same holes, so to speak, to use a metaphor. And I think, yes, things are changing a bit, but I don't think they're changing as much as your question might reveal. And so that's not my experience. I guess I should say it that way. So,
I myself am an older person, so I'm conscious that my own experience is very different from young people coming through at the moment. But the advent of the virtual nature of culture, the interconnectivity across and breaking down of cultural barriers, really makes me think that is there an opportunity to change the language to better reflect what's now a global phenomena. I mean, if you look at the S&P 500 in the added New York Stock Exchange, most of those companies have a large international component of finance and debt. I mean, America itself is not how it appears on a map. It's now a collection of international corporations that are running things. So how does that affect where we try to own responsibilities from the past, if in fact the modern generation no longer sees itself as an enclave of a particular culture?
Yeah, I think it's in us, even in the young people who are trying to get out of it. I teach, like you do probably, a lot of millennials, and they don't want the same paradigm that their parents had. They want a whole different paradigm. They don't want the same church. They want something different. They're looking for different things, but they also identify readily with the things that I'm talking about because that's what they grew up under watching, and that's what they don't want anymore. So I'm hopeful. I also believe that many of those corporations bear the same kinds of values that I've been talking about with Western values. And so we're still dealing with the same animal, so to speak. It just looks differently. So,
I've been wrestling with something that you've been saying, and the whole concept of dualism you've brought out many times. And I'm not trying to defend dualism, but as I heard you speaking last night, I noticed you using John's Gospel a bit, which I would think uses dualism the most of any of the Gospels. And I'm wondering, a couple questions are wrestling through my mind. One is there a hermeneutic lens that you kind of read John's Gospel with when you read it that might be different than mine in that? And then the second thing is, with regard to dualism, does there not have to be some of that in any society? Because wherever there's a sense of evil, there has to be a sense of something different than that too?
That's a little different kind of dualism than I'm talking about. Okay. So I'm talking about the specific dualism that says that we have to invest more in the spiritual, the products of the mind, over the body, the material world. Yeah. So do I think we have to have dualism? No, not the kind I'm talking about.
Okay. But there is, with that, is there not? Wherever there's a sense of evil, there has to be a sense of something that's not evil, right?
Well, just because there are two things of seemingly opposites, that doesn't mean that it's dualism in the way I'm talking about dualism.
Okay.
So I'm talking about Platonic dualism.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
And how would you read John's Gospel?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'd leave that to all the Johannine scholars. I'd get myself in trouble if I started to kick that around. So I would just say I'm unqualified to answer that. Yeah. Yeah.
I got my own question for you, but I thought I'd start with a little story for the background of the context. A number of years ago, when I really started to think more about what it means for me to be an Indigenous person and a follower of Jesus, I went to a conference, and Cheryl Bear was one of the speakers, and she talked about the role of humor in Indigenous culture. And that was the first time that I was able to look back on my family history and say that was the one thing that stuck through in my family when everything else was stripped away by Canada and by the church and others. So it was one of those things that came through. So I appreciate that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that when you say humor is sacred. I was reminded of a story. I don't remember where I read it, but it was talking about a monastery of monks, and it was an interview, or someone was observing, and he said he couldn't believe the amount of time they spent laughing together. But we don't talk a lot about humor. I've read a lot of books on Christian spirituality. They don't often talk about humor. The only time I can remember in seminary was about throwing in a humorous illustration in your sermon once in a while. So if you could just tease that out a little bit more of what we can learn and how we can bring that into our Christian spirituality.
Yeah. So, we used to at powwows a long time ago, and I just barely remember the end of this. We actually had clowns at our powwows. Maybe you still do up here, I don't know. And the clowns would do silly things, you know. It's kind of like the rodeos. If you've ever been to a rodeo, it has clowns, things like that. So we had that. Our MCs, you know, they're only a good MC if you keep people laughing all the time, right? And usually the jokes are at the expense of somebody. We have very self-deprecating humor, right? I have been around white folks and tried to show Native movies or Native humor, like Don Burnstick and other things like this. And the question that constantly comes up is, they're talking about such terrible things. How can they laugh about these things, you know? And I think maybe that's, I don't know if that's just a Native characteristic or if that's something for oppressed peoples, but it's sort of like, if you can't laugh at it, then you're going to die from it, right? So you have to be able to laugh at even the worst circumstances and be able to see something funny in it, something humorous. And I think that's part of that balance of life. And on a lot of our ceremonies, we have funny kinds of humor. So like having led Sweat Lodge for the last 30 years, you know, one of the things I was taught was if it gets to be too intense and people, it's so bad so people are just drained from all the serious heart talk and things that they went in, you take the fourth route and you make jokes or you tell funny stories to balance things out, right? Or I remember one time I was at a Hopi bean dance, and we're up on the plazas, and they have these kasharis, these clowns that go around and they talk to the people, the dancers who are in line, and there's this one kashari who was just telling this guy off, and everybody around was laughing. And of course we didn't speak Hopi, so I was asked my Hopi friend, you know, what is he telling them? And he says, he's like kind of shaming him, but it's funny. And he says, he's saying, hey, you're supposed to be such an upright person and faithful to your wife, and why is it on Friday nights after midnight we see your truck parked behind widow so-and-so's house? And everybody thought that was hilarious. Him getting outed that way, right? In front of everybody. So, all I can say is we have our own kinds of humor, right? And it almost always is somewhere scheduled in ceremony. And if it's not, it will be unscheduled. And the thing I think that surprises non-Native folks the most is when they come and hang out with Indigenous people is they go, I can't believe you guys laugh so much and have such a good time, you know. And I just think that's part of, maybe it's a survival mechanism, but it's certainly built into our value system now. So, yeah.
Keep singing, I'm walking. Scots can do humour as well. Can I tell a story?
Yes.
You know this one. Two men went up to the temple to pray. This comes up in the lectionary on Sunday. This is why I know it's there, because I have to preach from there. One a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you, I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He wouldn't even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Jesus, I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. As I've been looking at this, I realise that a binary interpretation of this passage immediately puts you in trouble. Because as soon as you side with the tax collector over against the Pharisee, you become the Pharisee by looking down on the other.
Right.
What I thought was a simple parable is now messing with my head. So, story, I love. But here, therefore, was my difficulty. Because in the presentation of one worldview against the other, I found that quite binary.
It is. Yeah.
And I don't live in actually either of those worlds you've described. And therefore, I think the practical question is, so where should I stand in like in the parable? I don't know where to stand anymore. I've got till Sunday to fix that. Or it'll be one of those sermons where I will say it's in the story and work it out for yourselves, but I expect I'm due to do more than that. So it's a practical question. Where do I stand as someone who's appalled by white supremacy? It revolts me. By someone who, despite what they say, loves community and all of that. But where do I stand? Because I'm not in either of these two worlds.
Yeah. So and I think I could make this really simple and just say I'm presented in a binary because I'm being contextual to the Western world. Yeah, but a better way to do what I'm doing, and a way that I had rather do what I'm doing, is like I stated in the beginning, is for us to sit around in a circle and for me to tell some stories and then to hear your stories and then for us to talk about them. And I think that's a non-binary way to do this, but we don't have that luxury in an academic setting usually.
Thanks again for all you've shared. I think of humor, I think of a book that really helped my perspective was Thomas King, The Inconvenient Indian. And my daughter gave it to me for my birthday. And it's about the best gift I've ever had in a long time. And how he uses his wife in, because he talks about intense stuff and then he brings his wife in as this, oh, come on, calm down a bit. And it's really quite a very, well, he's just a great writer, but that to me captures that mixture of what you're saying, like in written form, how he brings humor into, but it just drives home his point very clearly. I guess my question, in thinking about decolonization, and having spent time with youth, quite a bit of time with youth in the last number of years, I'm wondering how much decolonization is needed among the millennials of your Indigenous people, and are you finding that they want to go back or want to decolonize and discover their identity, or is it, do they live in this almost a duality of wanting to be in, not wanting to assimilate, and yet not knowing how not to, So I'm trying to figure out, is there decolonization happening within the young people that you work with, and how does that work itself out? Yeah.
Yes, no, and maybe. So one of the things I'm always mindful about is a workshop I went to in 1991. And it was done by the University of New Mexico, called Violence, Abuse, and Neglect Among North American Natives. And in that study, they did a number of things to see who were the most affected by violence and abuse and neglect. And they were able to create some sort of categories, right? And so what they created a category that was the very traditional, lived on the reservation or reserve. I think this was all United States, I'm sorry. So there was that category. There was the category of the people who lived off reservation, who lived mostly in cities, and which 70% of our Native people in the United States live in cities now, urban areas of our Native American people. But who visit the reservation, who meet at the Indian Center. Their kids might dance in powwows and things like that, and they keep their finger in the culture. And there was those who were completely assimilated, who, the kids played field hockey and water polo and, soccer, and all the white sports, And they just happened to be Native. Basically, they didn't understand themselves. They didn't want to understand themselves basically as Native anymore. So I'm going to just do a straw poll. How many think that the most extreme violence, neglect, and abuse were in the most traditional people on the reservation? Raise your hand if you believe that. Okay, let me see everybody's hand first. Let me make sure everybody can raise their hand. Can we all raise our hands? Okay, all right. Now, how many believe is among the most traditional? Okay. How many believe it was the people who sort of live in the center there? Okay. And how many believe it was by those who were most assimilated? Yeah, so you're right. Colonization doesn't seem to work on our Native people very well. It just doesn't stick. And so often we're just left with nothing, and then we try to fix it with all kinds of other remedies. I think there are young people who would, and my kids have gone through various stages, by the way. And we raised them to be traditional, but they've gone through different stages at different ages. And there are times when they'll say, I'm not going to worry about that. And there are times when they want more traditional identity. And I think it's just one of the dilemmas that we face because we have the choice in a colonized society. And there's so much pressure for them not to sense their culture and their identity through that culture. And so I don't really, I would not want to say that, there's a lot who do and there's a lot who don't. What I would say is that we're all we're all struggling with identity problems, right? Because of modernity and colonization. But I do come across a lot of young people who want to re-indigenize, so to speak. Often whether they were adopted out, or whether their parents were urbanized or whatever. But there are a lot of young people out there who want to be indigenized and re-indigenized, I would guess we would say. And that might mean different things to them. And, we've got hopefully a whole lifetime to learn, and people can make decisions at different times in their life. But we want to be there for people who are ready. So it's kind of the philosophy of the Miyagi from the Karate Kid, right? When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. So we want to appear when the student is ready. Yeah.
It sounds similar to what you said earlier about evangelism. process, the step that in some ways it's like cultural evangelism for these youth that as they are ready to be reintroduced to their culture. So
yeah, the older I get, I remember when I was very young, I was called impetuous so many times. The older I get, it's kind of a weird thing because the more passionate I am about our cause and our vision, and yet the more patient I am for people to get there. Yeah.
Maybe one or two more questions?
Dr. Woodley, I've been mulling this over, and I guess my context comes from a background of doing stuff in the inner city. And we've talked a little bit about vulnerability. And one of the decolonization thoughts, it's kind of swirling around in my head, but in those places where I would work beside people and with people who were that vulnerable, our backgrounds mattered, but we got past a lot of the us versus them and removed those us and them barriers much more easily than I see in the halls of power or democracy. And I just starting to think through a little bit more about liberation theology and those kinds of things, and wonder if you could comment on kind of where we could come into those relationships and begin that colonization process, maybe in untraditional or creative ways, and if you've interacted with liberation theology around some of this stuff too.
Yeah. So I like movements that go from the ground up, right? Because it gives more people a chance to participate, right? And I think the process will always turn around and bite you if they come from the top down. I think I maybe mentioned that a little bit in that last one, second to the last PowerPoint, that everybody has to be involved in the process. So we have a problem in the United States because we will say a group of people of color will want to change a system, and the people who are in charge, who are generally white, want to improve the system. They want to make it better for us because they have good hearts and good intentions and everything else. But they don't understand that the system, even if you improve it, is still not made for us. And so that means that we have to be at the table with them to create a new system. And that's a really painful process for institutions. It means letting some of your old things die and coming up with a new model. And because if the old DNA's there, it'll come out. So, and you know, when two people have a child, the only DNA those chromosomes are going to come from those two parents. In an organization, if you want different DNA, you have to introduce different parents to create a different child. And that's the best way I can explain liberation theology in terms of how I would think of it, is basically that it is a process in which the most people involved who can be are involved in creating that new box. And of course, some would argue that's what Jesus did.
So sort of a follow-up question is the experience that I had as these two, two addicts, a white addict and an Indigenous addict, and they connect around their oppression that they've experienced in a way that was, they still respected each other's backgrounds, cultures, contexts, but they learned from each other and cross-pollinated in a way that I thought was very redemptive. Like, the word that comes to my mind is magical, but that's way too mystical for a lot of people. But it was very, very intimate. And I've thought through, when I hear about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and all the sanitized language around what we're going to do and the solution orientation and all those things, and then the storytelling and Western people don't get into that because it takes a lot of time, all of those things. But I didn't experience that with these guys. They were willing to spend the time together. And so it was a bottom-up kind of thing. And I just wonder if there's places where you've seen that cross-pollination, how we could foster that in contexts like communities that we have where, because I see the separation. Like, I think the decolonization process would benefit Western minds as much, a de-enlightenment process, perhaps, I don't know, as much as it benefits Indigenous people. How would you, I don't know if you have any comments from that or stories from?
I think we're all in this together. When I talk about decolonization, I'm talking about all of us. When I talk about re-indigenization, I'm talking about all of us doing this together. Because it's if we're going to change our world, and if we're going to, I always hesitate to say save our world, but because I think the earth is going to be okay, but maybe we're not going to be around to see that if we don't do something together. I think now we're in sort of like the countdown stage, and we've got to do this together or it's not going to get done. And so we all need each other. I think there's nothing like common oppression to bring people together. And but hopefully relationships develop so that that's not all that's holding them together. Yeah.
Yep. So this is we'll go with the final question here. And I apologize to the one online that I'm not going to ask, but it was, I think you partially answered the last one. So this person says, thank you so much for all you've shared this week. After listening to your lectures, I feel very uncomfortable. And as you put it, separated from nature when shopping at the grocery store for meats, produce, etc. How do you recommend we operate in such a consumeristic culture? Should we work towards an alternative to using a store to receive our food from Creator?
Well, yeah, I'm against consumerism, so you should buy our seeds. Yeah, I think, who is actually doing more in this than anybody is the permaculture communities. They are really active and really fired up and doing all kinds of things. Urban permaculture and rural permaculture and CSAs and all of those folks, and we have hung around with them and tried to learn. We like hanging with them because we always learn something. They sometimes give a nod and a wink to the indigenous things they're doing, but a lot of what they're doing our people have done before. But yeah, I would say just get involved in a local permaculture group and start doing something with them, and you'll get turned on by being outside and growing stuff. At some point, I'm pretty sure our economy is not going to last in the U.S., and at some point that may be a means of survival, so it'd be good to have those skills now. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for your good questions, and Dr. Woodley for your insightful answers. I know you'll want to continue the conversation after our formal time together has ended, but I know that you will also want to join me in thanking Dr. Woodley for his time. Randy, we're so grateful, and on behalf of Acadia Divinity College, we'd like to say thank you for the time and thought you've put into the leadership of this year's Hayward Lectures. And I know I speak not only for myself, but for all of us in saying that our lives and our thinking are made better because of it, and that we'll continue to reflect on what we've heard and learned in the weeks to come. So may I end our time together by praying now for you and Edith and your ministry. Let's pray. God, we thank you for this time together. Creator, to ponder who you are, your earth, your people. I thank you now for the Woodleys and for their service to you, their desire to teach others and to share your good way of harmony. I pray now that you will bless and keep them, that you will guide them as they serve, and that you will give them your wisdom in the days ahead. We pray also that you will help us learn, process, and incorporate what you would have us to do from what we've heard this week. We thank you so much. In your name we pray. Amen. Thank you.